Hi, Brian.
Hi, Will. How you doing?
Very well. You're Bryan Caplan, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Is that correct?
It is.
And I'm Will Wilkinson, over at the Cato Institute, inside the city. And we're here to talk today about your new book, The Myth of the Rational Voter: Why Democracies Choose Bad Policies. It's a provocative thesis. You're already getting widely reviewed. There was a review in the New York Times already that we'll get to in a minute. And I should also do my duty as a representative of the Cato Institute to mention that an excerpt or a condensation of parts of Brian's book are now available as a Cato policy study. So if you go to the Cato homepage, you'll find a paper with the title of Brian's book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. So Brian, tell me a little bit about what got you thinking about issues about democracy and the quality of sort of democratic decision-making.
Yeah, it all goes back to when I was in graduate school, and I read a very interesting book by an economist named Donald Whitman. His book was called The Myth of Democratic Failure. And what Whitman did in that book is he went over a lot of arguments from the public choice school of economics and just argued that the conclusions didn't follow from the assumptions. And so, for example, there's a lot of arguments in public choice about how, because voters don't know what's going on, it's possible for special interests to take advantage of voters. And Whitman made the point of, well, just because voters don't know what's going on doesn't mean that there's going to periodically be a lot of spending on things that voters don't want. Maybe voters are going to exaggerate the amount of spending on things they don't like, putting a great deal of pressure on politicians to spend nothing on it, or very little. So anyway, going through Whitman's arguments, I realized that he had a lot of very good points, but there was just one that he kept falling back on that made less and less sense to me the more I thought about it, which was he built very heavily on the assumption that all errors that voters have must balance out. Right? So anytime there's a voter who thinks that protectionism is worse than it really is, there's got to be one who thinks that it's better than it really is. So in other words, built very heavily on the assumption that the average voter must be correct. And
so why did he think that was a good assumption?
Well, it's a very good question. Part of it is it's just a standard methodological assumption for economists and has been since the 70s. So in the 70s in economics, there was something called the rational expectations revolution. Robert Lucas eventually won a Nobel Prize for this. And basically it came down to saying, look, it doesn't make sense to assume that voters would on average make a mistake. Maybe they're too high, maybe they're too low, but it should all balance out. There are a few arguments that tried to give a deeper justification for this, but mostly it just became the kind of thing that everyone's supposed to believe. And even though it was really not empirically tested to that great of an extent, it became a key methodological building block. Where any time you want to tell a story to other academics that they can't just simply laugh at and say that's crazy, you're supposed to build in this assumption that on average voters are correct. And it's interesting, this assumption has become more mainstream. So with James Surowiecki's book, The Wisdom of Crowds, in a way this was taking this assumption that economists have been using for 30 years and trying to turn it into a popular book, right? And with some interesting results.
Yeah. So Brian, if I can back up just a little bit, ask a little more about it. Is the idea that the errors that voters make, that the errors are random? So if you have a random distribution of errors, and then the law of large numbers is just going to guarantee that. And this is what you call the miracle of aggregation?
Yes, that's right. So the idea behind the miracle of aggregation is this: if you go and talk to a random voter, you're going to find out that he knows next to nothing. And you may go and ask him questions like, how many years does a senator serve for? 2, 3, 10, for life? 1? These are questions that political scientists have established quite clearly are very poorly known to the general public. So if you talk to voters as individuals, you may become extremely distressed about democracy and say, look, how can this possibly work when the people who are participating don't have any idea what's going on? But then there's a standard reply to it, saying, look, well, it's true that individuals may not know very much. That doesn't mean that the system doesn't know a lot. It may be that a group of individuals actually is much better than any of the individuals, and this is a point that Surowiecki explains probably better than anybody else in The Wisdom of Crowds. It's a very, very nice point where he says, look, suppose that people have to guess the weight of an ox. right? Which is an actual, and there's an actual fair where Francis Galton went and gathered the data on guesses about the wave of an ox.
Yeah.
And it turned out that the average guess was better than the best individual guess, which seems, which at first seems logically impossible, but it's not. If you have everybody, if everybody is guessing and they either have an error of 10 pounds, 50 pounds, or 100 pounds, but however it's plus or minus, could go either way, then the average guess, if you have a lot of people, will be virtually exactly correct, and yet the closest guess will be 10 pounds off. And so that is the miracle of aggregation, that under the right assumptions, the average person can be correct, even though the typical person knows next to nothing.
Yeah, I believe as you know, Brian, my background isn't in economics, but is in sort of normative political philosophy. And in the democracy literature for a number of years, as you know, there's this large literature about deliberative democracy.
That's correct.
And the idea that a lot of people ideally ought to, gather together and think through issues together and then make choices. And one of the ideas that came up a lot in that was I think goes back to Condorcet, which is that if people are more likely than not to be correct about an issue, the more of them that you have, the more likely you are to converge on the correct answer. But the difficulty when you're talking in moral terms is that we don't have any independent standard for what the right answer is. So it's hard to know whether or not people are more likely, or more than that they're more likely than not to get the right answer, because you'd have to independently know what the right answer is. Now, in your book, you basically use the consensus views of economics as kind of the gold standard.
Economists, right. But,
the views of economists as the kind of the standard against which you're going to measure the quality of voter judgments. Can you tell us something about where you got this information about what economists believe, and then let's talk a little bit about how it is that ordinary voters systematically deviate from the consensus of professional economists?
Sure thing. So in 1996, there was a fantastic survey run by the Kaiser Family Foundation. It was called the Survey of Americans and Economists on the Economy. And what it did is made up a list of a whole bunch of different topics in economics that are relevant to policy, but these were descriptive questions. They weren't things about what should be done. They're questions about how the economy actually works, as a matter of fact. And what they did is they asked both the general public and, so like 1,510 members of the general public, so a very large sample, and 250 PhD economists who specialize in public policy, asked them exactly the same questions. And then it also gathered detailed information about things like income, job security, ideology, party, all these other things that you think might possibly have an influence on people's beliefs about how the economy works. And what's very interesting about this approach is that it, for the first time, made it possible to compare apples and apples. Right? So, in the past, there were a bunch of surveys about what the public thinks about economics, a bunch of surveys about what economists think about economics, but they never asked exactly the same questions. You can never really be completely confident that the economists and the public were really disagreeing, as opposed to simply seeming to have different answers to questions that were not quite the same.
Right.
So what the survey did is actually ask exactly the same questions. So first of all, we could establish as a clear fact that there was a disagreement. Right? So we could clearly establish that the average economist and the average member of the general public thought something different. Now, at this point, it's obviously still open to people to say, yeah, well, the public's right, the economists are wrong. Right. Now, I would say, at minimum, there's got to be a presumption that if the experts and laymen disagree, the experts are right. Right? This is a presumption. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. There could be exceptions, but at least as a starting point, if you knew nothing else about a subject, the idea that laymen are right and experts are wrong is hard to take seriously. And at least you'd like to say, really, why? Why do you think that experts are wrong and laymen are right?
Right. And this is one of those questions where you could also you could have some sort of independent verification, right? Because when it's this isn't just a matter of opinion. So, like if I'm sure if you polled biologists about the theory of natural selection and polled the public, you'll get a pretty big difference in the number of biologists and the number of
very substantial difference.
Yeah, but you can actually show that the predictions of the theory are borne out by actual empirical findings. So I think you could say in favor of your position, that say positions on trade that economists have, that they've got a set of theoretical assumptions, but you can actually point to the success of particular nations versus others and their trade policies as proving the point, right?
Right. Well, I mean, in basic terms, I agree with that. Although I would say that generally questions in social science are less cut and dry than questions in the hard sciences. I think that's clear. So I mean, it's hard to, you can't just go and look up in some statistical almanac and say, what's the answer to the question, what is the benefit of free trade for an economy? There isn't any statistical almanac that has the answer to that.
Right,
So in a way, one thing that I begin with is saying, look, there's a number of different strategies you could use for trying to grade the opinions of the public or the beliefs of the public. One is compare public opinion to objective numbers. So for something like budget numbers, you can do that. Right? So you actually can go to the statistical almanac of the United States and say, what is Social Security really? And what does the public think that it is? And so that's one approach. Now,
what percentage of the budget goes to foreign aid?
Yes, et cetera. Now, the problem with that is that many interesting questions are not in the almanac because they're a bit too controversial for someone to definitively say, here is the exact number. And that is where I think falling back on comparing expert consensus to layman to typical belief of laymen is a useful additional way of trying to get at who's right and who's wrong, or at least to get a presumption. Now, when I say presumption, that's basically saying, look, I'm open to the possibility that presumption is wrong. Right? Give me a reason. And that is a major part of the book in my research is saying, look, I'm listening. I'm willing. Or if you have a reason why you think that the experts should not be trusted and laymen's views are to be preferred, tell me what they are. Now, in the case of something like logic or statistics, there's pretty much no one on the other side saying, statisticians believe these weird things because they're in the employ of so and so, right? But in the case of economics, there is a long tradition of people not being very happy with the economics profession. There's a lot of people who don't like us very much.
So a lot of people,
it baffles me, but it seems to be true. Now,
yeah. So as opposed to statisticians, people impute impure ideological motives to economists in a way that other scientists don't get. Do you think that? I think you discussed this a bit in your book when you talk about market fundamentalism. Do you think it's a fair charge to say that that economists as a whole share a particular ideology, such that the consensus of views among economists is just a reflection of their political opinions? Rather than their expert findings as social scientists?
Well, I mean, here's what I would say. If you go and take a look at the ideologies and party identifications that economists have in normal terms, basically the typical economist is a moderate Democrat. However, he's a moderate Democrat who thinks that downsizing is good for the economy. Right? So when you think about that, you say, well, that's kind of weird. How is it that a moderate Democrat happens to get this view? And I think the general answer is that they were moderate Democrats long before they started studying economics, or more likely they were actually liberal Democrats when they started studying economics. They studied economics and it changed their mind. Generally, it may not have actually changed their values, which is why they still say I'm still a Democrat. Maybe I'm a bit more moderate than I was otherwise. Again, at the same time, it does convince them that the policies they thought were a good means for pursuing liberal democratic ends actually are not nearly as good as they thought. Right? So, I mean, one example that really does stick with me quite a bit is the minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage is not a policy like like protectionism, where there's an overwhelming consensus of economists against it. So, protectionism, you have something like 95% of economists thinking that it's a bad idea. Minimum wage is more like 50%. But it is very striking if you think how many people oppose the minimum wage before they study economics. Right? How many non-economists? What percentage of non-economists oppose it? And I'd say it's pretty darn close to 0%. There's about 0% of non-economists, roughly, think the minimum wage. Again, there are some, but the percentage is so small you can basically ignore it. However, on the other hand, out of economists, something like 50% think it's a bad idea, and it tells you something that half the people who study something change their mind in a direction that is totally socially unacceptable and will get them a lot of grief for the rest of their lives.
Okay, so that would be a good reason to think that it wasn't motivated by some prior ideological view. What are some of the other things, Brian? So you have and I know this is kind of the core of the excerpt that Cato has published. You go through some of the common fallacies that ordinary people are likely to be subject to in their capacity as voters, as opposed to the average economist. And again, like the average economist isn't some free market radical like Milton Friedman or something like that. The average economist is a moderate Democrat, right? And so but who has views that diverge quite widely from the consensus. So what are other examples? So you've mentioned the minimum wage. What are some other sort of systematic biases in economic thinking that voters tend to suffer from?
Yeah, why don't I just hit the big four that I have in the book? So the first one that I talk about, and which is, you can think about it as the core fallacy, is what I call anti-market bias. Basically comes down to looking at the market, seeing that people are greedy, and concluding that because their motives are impure, the result must be bad. Right, this is the kind of thing that Adam Smith criticized very heavily in The Wealth of Nations, and economists still quote today. But there's an interesting question: why do we keep quoting him? We keep quoting him because people don't believe it. Right? So when Adam Smith says it's not from benevolence the baker bakes his bread, but from his own regard to his own self-interest, and that's fine. That things work because of that. The economists have to keep quoting this because it's counterintuitive. It's not easy for people to accept, and it makes them mad. Right? Not only is it something that it's an unfamiliar idea, but it's also an idea that people find aggravating. It sort of grates on people to say, well, it doesn't really matter that their intentions are not to serve their fellow man. The results are still good. In fact, the results are often better because they want to make some money than if they didn't care about money. Whenever I'm in a restaurant getting some slow service, I often remark, imagine how slower service would be if there were no tipping. Right. It's because wouldn't it be awful to be waited on by a server who had no interest in money? Right? Because having no interest in money, you wouldn't have any particular incentive to do what you want, and you'd be frustrated. Because you can dangle the tip in front of the person that you wind up getting some decent treatment.
Yeah, this is a huge issue, and I think you're right that it's at the bottom of a lot of anti-market thinking. The idea that people ought to be motivated by sort of humanitarian impulses, or that they ought to be motivated by benevolence.
And if their impulses are wrong, that something bad's going to happen to you.
Yeah. Now, do you have the sense that people in general think that they are motivated by benevolent motives, but that everybody else needs to be on the guard against it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, well, let's see. I mean, there's one area where what you're saying makes a lot of sense. What makes a lot of sense to me, and I actually have it in the book. There's a section in my book on what I call the self-interested voter hypothesis, and this basically is the question of, do people vote their perceived self-interest? Okay, so and again, not in some tautological sense of whatever you do is in your interest, but in some common sense of what it means to be acting in your own self-interest. And
right.
One thing. First of all, when you take a look at the data, there's very little evidence of a significant effect of self-interest on how people vote. For example, income seems to have only a very slight effect on party identification, which is why you can have books like "What's the Matter with Kansas," right, or Andrew Gelman's paper, "What's the Matter with Connecticut." Turns out
I'm not familiar with "What's the Matter with Connecticut." What's his hypothesis?
Sure. I mean, basically, what Gelman, in a sense, it's a response to this book, "What's the Matter with Kansas?"
Right.
Basically, what Gelman shows is actually there's a lot of states where, at least within the state, you'll see that Republicanism is increasing in income, and essentially Connecticut is the state where this is least true. So basically, in Connecticut, there's, if I recall correctly, there's either no slope or maybe even a slightly negative slope, with the richer being just ever so slightly more Republican. But basically, what he does is breaks it down by state, and
okay. I have heard of that. So basically, that
so it's not Kansas that's
there's no
it's Connecticut that's the best
connection.
counterexample, not Kansas actually.
Because there's no statistical connection whatsoever to people's income and their voting patterns in Connecticut. Yeah, okay.
Right. But to go back to the self-interested voter hypothesis, so. So first of all, I was looking, reading literature and finding that it's very hard to find evidence of people voting, voting their self-interest. You can take a look at things like men are actually more pro-choice than women. Men are more in favor of the draft than women. You can always find little counterexamples. Like there was one cute survey that showed that when you ask 19-year-olds, should we first draft 18-year-olds first or 19-year-olds first, 19-year-olds say 18-year-olds and 18-year-olds say 19-year-olds. Right? So you can find these small marginal effects. But pretty much there's pretty weak evidence for the self-interested voter hypothesis. And then I started asking people, well, first of all, do you vote your self-interest? And most people say no. And I said, well, how about people in the party that you don't like? Well, of course them. How about the other people in the same party with you? And I started asking Democrats, why do you think, which I knew wasn't even true, but why do you think that poor people are more democratic, which, partly, like I said, it's not even true, but why do you think that it's true? And generally, they would immediately say, well, self-interest, because Democrats do more for the poor. So even people, not only do people impute negative political motives or selfish political motives to their opponents, even to their own side. So it's basically everybody but me is
so it's actually interesting. It's actually true that individuals don't vote on a self-interest basis. Yes, they still assume that other people do.
Yeah. So the way that I put it is, normally when you see someone who says I'm unselfish, everybody else is selfish. Normally, think that they're overestimating themselves, but the data suggests more that a better description is they're underestimating other people, at least in terms of motives, at least in terms of what they're trying to do when they vote.
Now, I think that point actually probably connects to one of your main sort of assumptions of the book, which is that people are rationally irrational, but I want to go back for a second to talk about to go back and talk about the ways in which ordinary voters' opinions diverge from experts. So the just basic anti-market bias.
Anti-market bias. So the view that the greedy intentions have to lead to bad results for society overall. And there's many subversions of anti-market bias. There, a very popular one are these conspiracy theories of price. The view that every industry's prices are set in some cigar smoke-filled room, except of course for the one industry that you're familiar with, which where there's cutthroat competition. I know one businessman who was convinced that in every industry except his own, that prices were set in a hotel room somewhere by a guy smoking cigars. In his own, he believed there was cutthroat competition. And what was his own industry? Defense contracting.
Defense.
So I'd say the one industry he actually knew something about, he saw a lot of competition, and then all the other ones that he was just basically making up, imagining what it must be like. He saw conspiracy.
Well, so that seems like a sort of you seem to be naming a fairly systematic bias where people have asymmetrical judgments about what they do versus what other people do, the sectors of the economy that they're most familiar with versus other sectors of the economy. It's the same sort of thing when everybody thinks that politicians are corrupt, but their congressman is good. The public schools are terrible. But Wilson Junior High, where they send Sally, is got great teachers. So
there's another interesting one about how do you feel about immigrants in your community? They're fine. How about immigrants for the country? Bad. Right? So the immigrants people actually see, they seem to be okay, but the country, all the places I don't see must be bad.
Yeah. So do you know of anything that explains that kind of systematic asymmetry in explanation? I don't, but I think it's a pretty interesting pattern that you see these asymmetries over and over again, which would seem to maybe indicate that people are using slightly different modes of reasoning when they're thinking about their own case and when they're thinking about something that they're unfamiliar with, which leads them to generate different kinds of conclusions. So do you know of anything that would explain why that is? At
least at first pass, I would say that people, just as a very basic matter, people have more reasonable views about things that they personally directly experience than about the things that they do not directly experience. And so, you'd have to be really, really delusional to look around the exact place that you live and think that it's drastically different than it really is. Whereas on the other hand, to think the places that you don't see and you haven't been, and to think that things are very different there, it's not so hard. So basically, I think it would require a much higher level of irrationality to have a very strange view about what you're immediately perceiving than about what's going on someplace that you've only read about in books or heard about. Right? So, it's a lot easier to have strange views about the afterlife than strange views about this life, right? Because the afterlife you haven't seen, so almost anything could be. You can imagine almost anything, whereas this life you've seen, so you're not going to say that this whole world is on fire. Right? Whereas afterlife, maybe the whole afterlife's on fire, and you never get the direct observation proving you wrong. And so, at least that's where I would start. There's probably a lot more to it.
Yeah. So to just fill out the sort of differences between economists and people. So regular people don't like free trade as much as economists do. Is that right?
Or I mean, I would say that's a special case of a more general thing, which is what I call anti-foreign bias. People generally, whenever foreigners enter the picture, they become even more pessimistic than they were otherwise. So whether it's foreign trade, whether it's immigration, even whether it's foreign aid in terms of how big of a drain on the budget is foreign aid. In reality, it's not very much, but people think it's one of the biggest items in the budget.
Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of bias where there's an easy sort of like evolutionary psychology.
I agree. That's the one where the mystery is the smallest.
Yeah, because people just are built to have a sense of coalitional identification and solidarity.
Yeah, and 100,000 years ago, when a new tribe moved in next door, maybe they were going to there's going to be some mutually beneficial trade. Maybe they were going to start hunting your common pool of animals, and maybe they're going to come and kill you in the morning. So,
right.
Whereas when Toyota sets a car dealership in Fairfax. There's no longer any reason to worry that this is stage one of their plan to club us over the head in the night or anything like that, and yet people still feel like, look, what's the real plan? Couldn't just be to go and benefit us by selling cars. There's got to be some hidden agenda here where they're trying to somehow destroy us.
So you would bring both attitudes towards trade and immigration under
absolutely.
Anti-foreign bias.
Right. In fact, I mean, one of the most interesting things about NAFTA, if you go and read, let's see, so I think it's still on Bill Clinton's homepage. If you go and read one of the main arguments for NAFTA, saying, look, it's true that NAFTA will let in more foreign products, but it's also going to reduce immigration. So if we accept these unwanted Mexican products, at least we can have fewer Mexicans coming here, and that's good, right? I say, look, I mean, I understand why you don't want Mexican goods, but but this is the way that you can have fewer Mexicans here, and that so in a way, the way that it was sold is by saying that you can have one, by accepting more of one unpleasant foreign thing, you can have less of a foreign thing that's even worse, and this was an argument that actually made sense to people.
That's strange. That's just weird to me, but. One of the things that puzzles me, because this has come up a few times, and I just want to riff a second on people's attitudes towards trade. A while back, your colleague Alex Tabarrok, in response to a post by Danny Roderick, but had a post about how people's views of trade have something to do with who they see the relevant moral community as being, and that if you're have the sense that the people who have the same passport that you do is the relevant community, then you're going to count any kind of loss that occurs to those people from competition by international trade, outsourcing, or anything like immigrants taking your jobs. You're going to count that very, very heavily. If you see the moral community as being the relevant moral community as whoever the parties to the trade are, then of course you don't see it in terms of sort of national in-groups versus national out-groups. I'm just trading with a Chinese guy. The parties to this transaction are me and him. The relevant set of people who are going to worry about because that transaction is going to create some kind of surplus from exchange. We're going to have to divide the surplus, but the people that we're dividing it among is me and him, not me and everybody else who has the same passport as me. Now the thing that I find interesting is not that people have this view that the members of their nation state are somehow special, but the fact that people have pushed out the boundaries that far, it strikes me that that's actually quite unnatural, that our sort of natural coalitional mentality is to just have a small band of 150 to 200 people, but as you note in your paper, like people don't think about the balance of trade between California and Nevada or between you and your grocer, but they do care about the balance of trade between the U.S., the United States, a gigantic 300 million person nation state, and China, a billion person nation state. Now, why is it that people... So the puzzle for me is why the nation state is the level to which people have scaled up when it comes to the unit of coalitional solidarity, when that seems to me just about as unnatural as seeing all of North America, say, as the relevant unit. So, could it be that people could get behind NAFTA just as long as they saw the relevant group as the U.S. and Canada and Mexico? And then one more step, maybe that's what's that is exactly the process that's going on in the EU, perhaps, that there's this move to get to get Belgians to see not Belgium as the relevant unit of coalitional identification, but Europe. And anyway, this is just me riffing on the point about anti-foreign bias. But do you think that that's something that's sort of ameliorable over time by changing who people take to be the foreigner?
Well, certainly over time. I mean, it's not that easy, but what you're saying reminds me of a very interesting area of history, basically 19th century French educational history, where they talk about the period of peasants into Frenchmen, where in the 19th century you have all these different people in a country called France, but who don't generally think of themselves as French. Right? So they think of themselves as belonging to a particular province of France, and there's really not much of a sense of national identity, but then you got national public schooling, which inculcated a sense of we're all Frenchmen, and by the time World War I came along, you had a whole nation that felt like their identity was France. Right? So, I'd say in evolutionary terms, it is a bit puzzling as to why our sense of what our tribe is so malleable, but it does seem like it is the kind of thing that if you get someone young and raise them in thinking that their community is France or the U.S. or the EU or that it's or California or whatever it is they're raised to think of as being the relevant moral community, that's the one that most of them will go and take with them for the rest of their lives. So it seems like it is malleable over a longer run. Sort of the key thing is the problem of the catch-22. Given that most people currently have a given identity, how do you convince them to educate their kids to have a different identity than the one they already have?
Yeah.
Right? So in the case of peasants and Frenchmen, there you've got a French elite, and at least a core of people want the whole country to be French, and they and since they have a very centralized, or as far as I understand, they had a very nationally centralized educational system. They were able to make the curriculum into a pan-French curriculum, which over time changed the way that people saw their community. So I say, over the long run, sure, it can change. It's just the kind of thing that it's hard to actually get a grip. It's hard to get a grip on the lever that you need to start doing the changing, because if most people already feel like America is the relevant moral community, then the schools are going to teach them America is the relevant moral community unless you can somehow subvert that. Now, let me go back to one other thing you were saying. It's certainly true that when you expand the moral community, the case for trade becomes stronger. Because if say both Americans and Chinese benefit from free trade between the U.S. and China, and if you count the welfare of both Americans and Chinese, then that case is going to be stronger than if you count the welfare of Chinese at zero, because they're getting something and our welfare is positive. But certainly the key economic case for free trade is that it's actually beneficial at the level of the nation. Right, so even if you were someone who said, I don't care about the Chinese, all I care about are people in the U.S., even then it would still make sense to be a free trader because Americans on net benefits. This is actually the point of what may be the very best short story explaining the case for free trade, which you can get in Steve Landsberg's book, The Armchair Economist. Did you read that, Will?
What's it? The Armchair Economist?
The Armchair Economist?
Yes, I have. It's a
wonderful
book.
There's a chapter called The Iowa Corn Crop. And it has a very nice fable. And it says, suppose there's a guy who he's invented an amazing new technology. It's a technology where you set up a factory on the beach, and you put corn into the factory, you turn a crank, and cars come out somehow. Right? And everyone is amazed by this new technology. How could you possibly turn corn into cars? It doesn't make sense. Chemically, it doesn't even seem right. And yet there he is doing it. And the guy becomes a national hero. Everyone thinks it's great. And sure, you got some negative coverage saying it's unfortunate that some American auto workers have lost their jobs. But on the other hand, people say, well, it's the price of progress. This guy's got a machine that turns corn into cars. Are we going to sit around making cars out of steel for the rest of our lives when this guy is can do it for a tenth of the cost? Come on. Right, but then an investigative journalist goes and sneaks into the plant and finds out there's no machinery in the factory, and all that it is a dock where you load the corn up on boats, sail it to Japan, sell the corn, buy some cars, and bring it back, and that's the factory. All right. Now I think this is probably the best the best little short story explaining what economists are talking about in the case for free trade, saying, look, as Landsberg said, the fact that there exists a country called Japan with people is irrelevant. Yeah. As far as Americans are concerned, this is a factory for turning corn into cars.
The factory is called
the factory is called trade. But who really cares exactly how it works? The only reason you would care is if you actually if you went beyond simply being indifferent to the fate of the Japanese and actually hated them. If you act, or of course, fear. Or it doesn't have to be hate; it could be fear. If you're worried that they're going to, yes.
I just have a question. So what that story establishes is that there's a kind of conceptual parallelism between technological change and trade. That you have no that you have no reason to care whether the price came down because a labor-saving device has made labor more efficient, or because it's to somebody else's comparative advantage to produce it, and so it's at a lower cost. Now, but it does seem like like in the surveys that you cite, do people have a different attitude toward people being displaced from jobs because of technological progress than they do from trade?
Yes, absolutely. So there's one particular question on the survey that asks people about the economic effects of technological progress. And while economists are essentially unanimous in favor of it, the public is still something like 90% in favor of it.
Yeah.
Right? So economists are even sure that technological progress is good overall, but even among the general public, it's hard to find people who think that it's a bad thing that we have technological progress. So this is actually a particularly interesting question because the stereotype about economists is that we always say on the one hand, on the other hand, never give you a straight answer. But on technological progress, economists say, yes, technological progress is good, the answer. And on the other hand, for the public, you're more likely to get yes, but on the other hand, there's these negative, there's these downside. You can't, there's things are not black and white. So, but it's very rare to get an answer from the public saying technological progress is bad. So that's why I say, look, all right, they're not, it's not completely crazy, but nevertheless, they're less optimistic about technological progress than economists are.
Yeah. So I want to press this point a little bit about the consensus among economists. Now, as you've probably seen, there's this pretty raucous discussion going on now over at TPM Cafe Book Club that your colleague Tyler Cowan has participated in, and he's gotten some testy responses from James Galbraith and Max Sawicki on there's this article I think by Chris Hayes, who also reviewed your book on heterodox economics, now, which brings up an issue that Hayes raises in his review of your book, which is that he says that, and I'm quoting here now, Caplan overinterprets the degree of economic consensus. He stresses that appearances to the contrary, economists agree on a broad range of principles, and that data from the survey bears this out. But he says, but then he goes on to say that that your book eats its own tail. Caplan wants to grant a presumptive authority to the consensus view of economists, but the consensus view of economists is that voters are rational. Now, there's two issues there. One is that is this issue about whether or not the consensus of the economics profession really represents expertise, or as this sort of whole debate about heterodox economics is sort of discussing whether or not there's a whole sort of group of economists who are systematically ignored. So that if you actually took, and that the consensus that you have in the economics profession is a function of the sort of neoclassical mafia, basically purging the profession of anybody who doesn't share their market fundamentalist assumptions. So I'd like you to address that, and then we can talk about this question about whether you're sort of self-defeating, whether your argument is self-defeating by itself going against the economic consensus. So what do you think about the idea that that heterodox economists are hounded out of the profession by the neoclassical mafia, and therefore perhaps the consensus of economists isn't really representative of expertise?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways you can come to this. In terms of the social sanctions, I don't think the social sanctions for being heterodox are all that large. You can have a very nice, pleasant career as a heterodox economist, and in fact, if you go and take a look at top economics journals, you have a very large number of market failure articles that are published. It's not like you can't say anything bad about markets. In fact, what I point out in the book is most of the criticisms of markets that we actually see are made by economists. Because there are economists who take a look at the consensus and say, well, but don't you need the following assumptions to be absolutely sure of this? And they go and pursue it and say, yeah, it turns out you do need some additional assumptions in order to be sure the market's going to work. So, I think economists are really pretty good for self-criticism. And also, you're unlikely to get the kind of sanctimonious negativity in economics that you may get in some other areas if you go and challenge the conventional wisdom. I mean, it's true, of course, that any time that you disagree with what the typical person in an area thinks, there's some cost to it. But the main thing I'd say is that at least the main theories of what's wrong with economists. Sort of this theory of right-wing bias, that doesn't seem to be true. In fact, economists generally start out from a moderate left-wing view and yet still wind up thinking things that are really quite different from what most people do. And, and the other thing is, another popular view that comes out of the Marxists is that economists are basically rich and have a lot of job security, and they're capitalists running dogs. They basically been bought off. But again, what you can see is that rich economists with tenure basically think something very different from rich non-economists with tenure. Right? So I mean, that explanation doesn't really seem to fly either. Although in the end, I would say, look, you can't. There's no purely formal way of making up your mind about whether or not you can trust the experts. If you still have doubts, the best thing to do is take out a textbook and read it. Right? Take out a textbook and read it and say, does what a typical economist says about these issues make sense to you or not? I think it's pretty hard to go and read the textbook and at least not say a lot of this makes sense, and even though most people don't think it, it's right. Of course, if you go and try and take the Caplan challenge and open the textbook and read it and say this is all nonsense, there's not that much more I can say to you. But I mean, I am saying I think very few reasonable people would do that and not walk away and say, I've learned something here. If
Bryan,
open mind.
Bryan, would you say I'm interested in just this terminological issue. When I maybe it's because I hung around George Mason so much when I worked at IHS and Mercatus, but you often heard the idea that Mason is a heterodox economics department. But it's heterodox in a free market direction. Where there's a lot of Austrians and economic historians who aren't quite in the mainstream. Now, do you consider yourself like an orthodox rational choice guy, or do you think of your research program as somewhat heterodox?
Well, I mean, in the end, I guess it's somewhat heterodox. What I'd say, I'm basically I see myself as a normal economist who wants to talk to other economists about advancing the field, right? Advancing the discipline, advancing human knowledge.
Right.
So, which actually takes me into your other point about whether the book is self-refuting. Right?
That's right.
Is it self-contradictory just to say I have a presumption that economists are right about issues within their field, and yet they're wrong about one particular issue within their field? In fact, I see no contradiction at all. You can say, look, on average, generally economists are right about things. At the same time, it's perfectly sensible to say, and here's an exception, right? And why am I writing the book? I'm writing the book because I'm trying to push the consensus in a better direction.
So let's get back into the core argument of the book. So the thing that Hayes accuses you of being heterodox about, which is the voter rationality assumption. The core of the book is the denial of the fact that voters are rational, and your reasoning behind that is that in certain domains of choice, the costs of being wrong are lower. Is that it?
That's certainly a major piece of the puzzle. Yes. So, the point that I make is. Suppose, for example, that you are a surgeon who believes that he can perform surgery perfectly well while drunk. You think you're so great that I'm better drunk than the typical surgeon is sober. Now you could have that belief, but that is a very costly belief because it's almost certainly false, and you're going to ruin your life with it. But on the other hand, suppose that surgeon were to think that our country would be much richer if we closed the border.
Right.
Well, what happens when one person decides that? Generally nothing. Right, because you're just one person, and in order for policy to change, you need hundreds of millions of people to change their mind, or 100 million people to change their mind anyway. And so the cost of having a crazy political view is, at least on average, is really quite small. Although, basically, very much like with pollution, a cost that is trivial at the level of the individual can be devastating at the level of society. So, when you see someone driving his car, you rarely think, "Wow, that is what is he thinking? He's poisoning his own air." Right? You say, "Well, he's poisoning it just a very little bit." So, to try to convince someone to give up driving because he's poisoning his own air would be pretty silly because the effect is so small. And yet, of course, if millions of people do poison the air, things can get very unpleasant, as they do in, say, Mexico City or Cairo, according to some people who've been there on bad air quality days. Right? So basically, the collective effect of people thinking only about what belief feels right, feels good for them, while ignoring the consequences, can be quite serious.
So the completely analogy that you're making. So you're saying that there's a kind of collective action problem here. That when the cost of making a mistake in politics is low, and you aggregate all these individual mistakes, you get what is in effect political pollution.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can get everyone waving the flag for a war that's in the end going to be devastating for almost everyone, and yet if everyone else is waving the flag, what do you want to do? You want to be the hated martyr or the hated dissident who says, you're all wrong and I'm against this? A few of us do, but most people would rather just fit in, wave the flag, and try to feel good about what's going on. Right? And as one person, it is very hard to make a difference, and so people often wind up going along or actually even sincerely believing in something which, if believed by enough people, is going to be devastating just because, at the margin, what can one person do?
All right, so your recommendation then is to take certain things off the table democratically. So the issues in which sort of individual voters who are going to be rationally irrational about particular, and by rational, now explain briefly what the difference is between the idea of rational irrationality and the idea of rational ignorance.
Certainly. So just to back up, thinking about what is the difference between ignorant and irrational. Right? Here we're starting off with normal English words, which then have been formalized to have more particular meanings by scholars. Although trying to formalize them in a way that is true to the original meaning. Right? So, in general, if you were to say, this person is ignorant or this person is irrational, it seems like the key difference is with ignorant. It sounds like, look, the person just didn't have all the facts. Right? The person just didn't know what was going on. It was an honest mistake. On the other hand, when you accuse someone of being irrational, there it seems that you're saying something stronger. It's more like, look, the person had the information to get the right answer, but they just didn't. Why not? Well, they weren't trying very hard. Right? Or they weren't willing to be objective about the facts, or they weren't willing to exert the mental discipline. So, in general, ignorance is basically saying, look, the person was wrong for reasons, in a sense, outside of his control. Anyone who had that information would have come to the same conclusion. On the other end, with irrational, it's more along the lines of saying this person is violating some basic norms of how it makes sense to think, right? How people ought to think. So, here's an example. Just to have a provocative example. In general, it is insulting to tell someone that his views on something are just religion, right? So you say, your views on global warming, it's just religion, right? It's an insult, right? And why? And when you think, well, why is that an insult? Well, it's an insult because we have a sense that in areas like religion, people generally hastily adopt views not because they make the most sense on given the balance of evidence, but because they feel good. And even if they haven't studied very much, they still seem to be very certain, and they also get very angry in many cases if you challenge them, right? So these are sort of all what I call symptoms of irrationality. People look like they aren't even really trying to get to the truth because they're jumping to a conclusion with certainty and getting angry when the messenger comes along and says, I've got some other evidence. You want to take a look?
So I want to clarify that. Because I know to a lot of ears that the very concept of rational irrationality sounds, of course, sort of contradictory. But the reason it works is because you're actually trading on two separate senses of rationality. So there's economic rationality.
Yes, exactly.
In the one sense where people are maximizing utility, you keep that constant.
Yes.
But then you assume that there is some cost to applying norms of epistemic rationality.
Right, or particularly the cost is you may have to change your mind about something you don't want to change your mind on. Right? So, if you're always open to new evidence, then all your beliefs are on the table. Right? It's possible that someone can come along and pop all your balloons, and then you're left without any of your basic views, and the world seems cold and meaningless. There's a great book, The God That Failed, which is autobiographies of ex-communists. And I cited this a number of times in the book. Basically, a universal theme is every one of these guys was emotionally devastated by the abandonment of the Marxist-Leninist worldview. Right. So I think Arthur Koestler said it was emotional harikiri. It was like suicide to have to not be a communist anymore. Those views gave meaning to his life, and to have to walk away from those views was very painful for him. And yet, if he had just been much more irrational about things and had just been much less willing open to evidence, he never would have had to change his mind because whatever came along, he just would have said, no, it's all capitalist lies. You can't believe them, or whatever.
So when people make a sort of deep emotive commitment to a particular ideology or to a set of beliefs, they're going to the cost of giving up their belief is high in terms of because people define their personalities, their identity is wrapped up in it, and so when you have evidence that runs counter to your identity, the cost of taking on a whole new identity is so high that people will dismiss the evidence or selectively
So if
seek
you can
out.
just relax intellectual discipline, you can keep believing whatever you feel like believing.
So I want to, but we're starting to run out of time, and there's a couple more issues that I want to get to. In his New York Times Magazine piece about your article, Gary Bass writes towards the end that Caplan's view of democracy is all about efficiency and not legitimacy, which raises questions about why people like democracy, and the conflict I'm always running into when I'm thinking about democratic theory is the difference between what I think of as the classical liberal view of democracy, which is basically a kind of administrative view of democracy, that because you can we have to have some mechanism for deciding things that affect all of us. Consensus doesn't work because you can never get unanimity. So you need some set of institutions that is going to allow people to make decisions that affect everyone in a way that most people will endorse and go along with. And what democracy just happens to be that institution. It's the institution by which we make decisions about things like public goods. And whether or not democracy is good or legitimate depends on just how well it serves that function. On the other side, you have a view that's, I think, deep. Well, it's very deep in Rousseau. It comes across in Kant to a certain extent. That a more romantic idea of democracy, that we find out what is really good for us through the process of democratic deliberation and choice. And that the legitimacy of democracy comes from the fact that it is the sort of joint expression of our sort of collective preferences, but not preferences that we have independently, but preferences that have been shaped by our sort of deliberation with one another as citizens. Now, your book is very much in the classical liberal tradition of democracy is good just as long as it provides the goods, just as long as it provides efficient administration of the public goods that free citizens should want. And you seem to care not a whit about this other tradition of democracy. Like Hayes in his piece keeps talking about you're willing to go dark places, which I found funny. I don't think you're willing to go dark places. I think it just means that you don't
embrace
care.
the dark side. It's a Star Wars reference.
Yeah, and I felt like you got a little bit of this in the Cato Unbound discussion of your work, where, like David Estlund, for instance, who is a theorist of democratic deliberation, kind of came at you. Well, basically everybody in that discussion actually came at you for your view that if democratic means aren't working, right? If when you aggregate individual choices, they end up creating stupid policy, and the justification for this kind of thing is purely instrumental, then let's just find a different mechanism. And you propose that a different mechanism might be just having experts do it. But everybody goes crazy every time you say, let's have an expert panel of economists who are sort of like the Supreme Court who decide that policy is uneconomical. So, I want to hear what you have to. Well, your response to people who worry that you're thinking of democracy as too instrumental and so thinned out and not robust and moral enough. What's your reaction to that kind of response?
I mean, I guess the first thing that I say is that in writing this book, I was. There's only so much that I can do in one book. I wasn't going to have an entire book on democracy in general. So I just wanted to focus on a series of questions that other economists and political scientists have been talking about, which seem to have big implications for the broader world. I'm interested in these questions of legitimacy as well. Although there again, I would say that it's an open question as to whether your non-economic concerns also cut against democracy.
Yeah.
So, so for example, just in terms of autonomy, so 75% of people vote to say that marijuana is illegal. Right, so that's, even if that were efficient, I would still say, maybe that's an efficient decision, but it still seems wrong. It still seems wrong for 75% of people to tell 25% of people that they can't use this. Right, so there definitely are other concerns that I have. In this book, I was trying to narrow down the subject to get to something manageable. I'm certainly not dismissing these other concerns, although I think it's likely that I wind up having a contrarian view on these other measures of how well democracy is doing too.
Right. So you're not. I mean, you're not romantic about democracy at all. I mean, am I correct in characterizing your?
There's sort of your various Mencken quotes about democracy. Always make me laugh. The democracy, the worship of jackals by jackasses is one that I can never. I never read Mencken's line on that and not chuckle a bit. So, it does seem to be a bit odd to think that you just go and find out what most people think and then do that, and whatever it is, no matter how awful it is, what if they're wrong? It seems like an important question, and not only are they wrong, but they're doing it to a lot of people who don't want to go along with it, and why can't they just leave them alone?
Yeah, I've got another question about the idea of having basically just sort of doing an end run around the democratic process and having people who actually know what they're doing set policy. Now, the thing that I think is sort of tantalizing and fascinating about that proposal is that we already do it a lot, and people seem not to have that big of a problem with it. So
there's a classic case of status quo bias, where the things that we currently have decided by experts, we're comfortable with it. But if you suggest expanding that by the slightest amount, then people freak out and say that you're advocating dictatorship. Right? So you have an independent central bank, Supreme Court, everyone takes those for granted. But to give the Council of Economic Advisors some power to veto legislation, you're crazy. It's insane. What kind of person are you?
Well, I mean, the thing is that, I mean, of course, that the whole idea of judicial review by the Supreme Court drives a lot of democratic theorists crazy. That the idea that a bunch of so-called experts in law could overturn the expression of the people's will strikes a lot of democratic theorists as is completely intolerable. But I think you're right.
Would you actually say that that's the final conclusion? I'd say that, wouldn't you say that it's more like it disturbs them a bit, but at the end they wind up rationalizing basically the status quo that we have?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't think people have that big of a problem, and I don't think most people have a problem with the expert culture that we have running the Federal Reserve. Now, I think it's interesting that the Federal Reserve, for instance, I think neither the Federal Reserve nor the Supreme Court have been as professionalized in the past as they are now. That there's a sort of interface between the informal institutions of education and the formal institutions of government. So I think Alan Greenspan probably will be the last Fed chairman who is not a PhD economist from a major university. And just as you're not going to get like I mean, I don't remember